The mics are not working properly.
So is this working? Yes, it seems to be working. Okay. Okay, yes, so that's good. Okay. So thanks a lot for inviting me. So first let me, first apologize for the fact that my English sounds a lot like French, as you can see, and I hope this will be okay for you. Let me also say how happy I am to be here in India to be able to speak about this book. I've been many times to India, but I should come more often. And first time was about 20 years ago with my friend Abhijit Banerjee, and with whom I have been working on the evolution of inequality in India. But I would like to do a lot more work on India and come much more regularly. So here, today the official excuse is to give this lecture, and also I'm going to the Jaipur festival where the Hindi version of my book will be presented, I guess, tomorrow or on Saturday at the Jaipur festival, and I'm very glad that my book is now available in the Hindi language. So what I'm going to do today is to present a number of results from this book and to sort of describe to you the kind of research that we have been doing and what the kind of questions that we are now looking at. So this presentation is going to be based partly on my book. So let me describe very quickly what we have tried to do in this research. Let me first say very clearly that although I am the only one responsible for any mistakes that might be in the book, I am certainly not the only one responsible for the research program that made this book possible. So this book is really based on a very collective data collection research program which started about 15 years ago when I started working on the history of income and wealth inequality in France, and then I was very fortunate to find many co-authors and collaborators. Tony Atkinson, who is like the godfather of all historical studies on inequality, together with Simon Kuznets in the 50s, and Tony Atkinson, starting in the 70s, wrote many important work on inequality. And right after I published my work on France in 2001, he took up the British case, and together we have been publishing a number of volumes in order to cover on more and more countries. With Facundo Alvaredo, we've been working on Argentina and Chile, with Abhijit Banerjee on India, with Nancy Chian on China, and so this has become a very international research program, and this is still going on. I should say that I'm sorry that India in particular doesn't take a bigger part of the book than in my presentation today than it should. Partly this is not my fault, this is just that the historical data, and including sometimes the current data, is not available as much as I would like it to be. But certainly we are making a lot of effort to try to extend our work to all parts of the world. And one of the positive impact of the publication of the book is that in a number of countries it has also induced government to open data that was not available before. But beyond the issue of data, the general objective behind this project is to put the study of the distribution back at the center of political economy, where I think it should be. And this is the general objective, and of course this is a very ongoing and long-term project. So today I will present a number of historical evolution, try to draw lessons for the future. Let me say that all series are available online on this website or on this other website, the World Wealth and Income database, where we are putting new data online almost every week. So I'm sorry that I cannot put the book online, although I'm sure it's possible to find it somewhere, but at least all the data is there, and the main objective is to make it publicly available so that people can take it and move further. Let me say very clearly that there are different ways to interpret historical data. I try to present in the book and in my lecture what I view as the most reasonable and consistent interpretation of the data, but I have no problem if some people come with different interpretation. We are in the social sciences, and there are different ways to interpret trends. We know too little. I think we know a little bit more about inequality dynamics than we used to, but certainly we know too little to be sure about anything, and people will keep fighting about inequality forever, but at least maybe we can contribute to have a more informed democratic fight or discussion about these issues based on this data. So if you want to know, I'm going to present a number of evolution today. If you want to know more about the database, you can go to the World Wealth and Income Database website. So the countries in red are already in the database, although some countries like India, the data, as I will show you, has stopped in 2000 regarding the income tax. Countries in blue, like Russia or China, are countries for which we still do not have full access to the income tax data for any period. At least for India, we had it until a certain time. But we are now trying to get access to the data. So like countries like Brazil and Mexico are examples of countries which we did not have access to the data at the time I published the book. But after the publication of the book, there was more pressure to the tax administration and government, and we were finally able to access the historical records from income tax, and in certain cases inheritance tax and wealth tax data, and we are now using it. So, being in the database means that we are trying to exploit all the historical data that we can find on income and wealth in a given country. And in most countries, the oldest source of information on income and wealth comes from the tax system. So in particular, so like in the US, we start in 1913 because this is when the modern federal income tax in the US was created. In France, it was 1914. In Britain, the proportional income tax system of the 19th century became progressive in 1908. So this is basically when we start. So it's important to realize that taxation is always more than taxation. It's also a way to produce information about society. It's a way to produce legal categories, statistical categories. So in the 19th century, when you don't have an income tax anywhere, you don't know anything about income. So the tax system use other tax base, like in France, we have the contribution on doors and windows in the 19th century. So you have all sorts of beautiful statistics on the number of doors and windows at the local level, which is fascinating. But it's in a way it's less informative than income or wealth as an indicator of economic power or economic resources. So with the introduction of modern tax system, in particular the income tax was created pretty much everywhere between 1900 and 1920, 1922 in India, although there was already a sort of proportional tax system on different income categories in the late 19th and early 20th century. When you don't have this system, you have very little historical information. So of course tax information is not perfect. You have to correct it in many ways and combine it with other independent data sources, but it's better than no data at all. So economists have been interested about inequality forever. In the 19th century, many economists like Ricardo, Marx were writing about inequality, and sometimes they had very powerful intuition about what was going on, but they had very limited data, which puts limits on what you can say, or actually sometimes it puts no limit on what you can say, which is even worse. But so at least here, what's new in this research program is that for the first time, also thanks to the development of modern information technology, we are able to collect this at a scale that was not done before. I think another reason why it was not done before is because this kind of historical material was viewed as too historical for economists and too economic for historians, so nobody was sort of using it, partly because of excessively sharp boundaries between disciplines of the social sciences. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to make the following 3 points using this data. first point will be about income inequality, and the other two about wealth. So the first point will be about the long-run dynamics of income inequality. I will talk about the end of the Kuznets curve, the end of universal laws, the idea that institution policy matter for the long-run evolution of inequality, and maybe one of the most important historical lessons for a country like India, but I think for all countries in general, is that during the 20th century, it took really major shocks in Western countries for a reduction in inequality to take place. It's not something that happened, spontaneously, naturally, and it doesn't mean that this has to be like this in every country, of course, but I think it's important to have this historical record in mind, and that it's only after major shocks, after World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, that the elites in Western countries accepted a number of social reform, tax reform. In my country, in France, the income tax was created in the summer of 1914, and this was not to pay for schools, this was to pay to go to war with Germany. And then after 1945, these same instruments were used to pay for social spending, schools, social security was created, but this is not something that happened, unfortunately, very regularly. And one of the findings from my work is that until World War I, there was no trend toward a reduction of inequality or rise of progressive taxation or social policy, and it's really the history of income inequality in the 20th century cannot be understood as a purely economic history. It is really a political, a cultural, a social history, and there are reasons to believe it will be the same in the future, hopefully through more peaceful transition, but certainly political forces, institution policy will play a major role. The second point I will make will be about what I call in the book the return of a patrimonial or wealth-based society. This is the idea that wealth-income ratio seem to be returning to very high levels in rich countries, partly because of growth slowdown, but there are other legal and political reasons as well. Now, this could happen to the entire world in the long run, and I'm trying to stress in the book, the metamorphosis in the forms of capital ownership from your land to patents and immaterial capital, and that this raises new issues about capital regulation, which become particularly important in countries where the wealth-to-income ratio is very high, which is not necessarily bad in itself, but raises new policy issues. And my third point will be more specifically about the long-run evolution of the concentration of wealth, and I will argue that one of the determinants in the long run is the gap between the net of tax rate of return, the growth rate. So of course, in a country where growth rate is 8% per year, so I understand even more than China today, down to 6%, and I can see the role that this plays in the Indian and Chinese debate. You can think that the growth rate is going to be very high for a very long time, but the historical experience suggests that it will not be 8% forever, and at some point when convergence gets closer, probably these issues about the lowering of growth rates will become important for India also, but of course it will take a very long time. Now, there are other forces that can generate very high wealth inequality and concentration in high growth economies, of course, and in any case, I think there's a need for more democratic transparency and regulation of wealth dynamics, and this will be my third point. So before I move to these 3 points, which again, I must confess that I will not be able to present historical series for India for all of these 3 points. Let me say a few words about how we can compare inequality in India with the data on mostly developed countries that I would show in the rest of the lecture. So, income and wealth concentration in India today, is probably very high by international and historical standards. So to give orders of magnitude, it's probably closer to Brazil or South Africa, where the share of income going to the top 10% is 50, 60%, or even more than 60% in South Africa, maybe 65%. Now, India is probably closer to this range, 50, 60, than to the US, where it's about 45, 50% for the top 10, or Europe, where it's 30, 35. But in reality, the real thing is that we don't really know, and I do not really know, and I am not able to make a proper comparison, so I will not try to put India on the graph, because, in particular, because there's an extreme lack of transparency about information and income in India. And I really want to stress that, it's impossible to access income tax data in India. In particular, there was a complete interruption of all India income tax statistics publication in the year 2000, which existed for many decades. So it's quite a unique case in history where you have a decline in transparency and publication about income taxation. There are other countries where there is an income tax, but no income tax statistic at all, like China. What's unique about India is that this is a country with an income tax, no income tax statistics at all, but there used to be some. And that's, to my knowledge, this is unique. And so I don't know what's going on. I don't know why there is not sufficient pressure from the media, from the university to make this change. So I have been in touch with many people at all levels in India for the past 15 years to try to understand why this cannot change. Everybody tells me, this will change in the next 3 months, 6 months, and I've been told that, last week, last month, and maybe this will be the good time, but there's no way I can know because I've been told this for the past 15 years. Let me make very clear that nobody is asking for names. We are talking of fully anonymous data. Today, we do not even know the number of taxpayers and amounts of income by income brackets. So you want to know how many taxpayers in India had between 5 million rupees and 10 million rupees, between 10 and 20, what was their total income in billions of rupees? You don't know. So we are not asking for names. This is purely anonymous information. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the data will be perfectly reliable. There will be a lot of problems with the data, but I think, in fact, even in particularly in countries where there are reasons to believe that the income tax system is not working perfectly well and there is tax evasion, you have tax evasion in every country, but I would say even more in countries where you have problems with the tax administration, you want to see the data in order to, in many cases, this will be a way to reach and all these other mechanisms. There's a specific mechanism which I think matters a lot for the long-run evolution of wealth concentration, which is the gap between R and G, where R is the net of tax rate of return to wealth and G is the growth rate. And to the extent that there will be a higher gap in the future, then wealth inequality can keep rising, particularly in developed countries. It's important, when we talk about the gap between R and G, it's important to realize that, of course, not everybody is getting the same R, the same rate of return. So maybe the gap between the average rate of return and the growth rate is not that large, but the gap between the rate of return obtained on very large wealth holdings, very large financial portfolios, and the growth rate can be much more significant. So to illustrate this, let me show you, so this is data from Forbes wealth rankings of billionaires for the entire planet. Let me say right away, that this is not particularly reliable data, and that I am a bit ashamed to show this to you. But on the other hand, because of the lack of public statistics and transparency about wealth, we don't have this data. If you look at I would prefer to have a Eurostat or IMF or World Bank official statistics on the evolution of top wealth group in the world, but partly because some of these organizations were opposed for a very long time to automatic transmission of information system and cross-border foreign assets. We don't have this kind of information. So when you look at the household wealth survey you have in Western countries, I was talking about the lack of statistics in India, but regarding wealth measurement, I think the situation in North America or Europe is not much better, and what we have in terms of either tax data or household wealth survey is very insufficient, so we have to do with what we have. And so in the book I try to combine very different set of data sources because we have to be pragmatic and see what we have. So here is what we can learn from this. So I started in 1987 because this is when Forbes magazine started to publish their world list of billionaires. Now, what people do, so what I do here is not very sophisticated, but it's a bit more sophisticated than what people do usually. So usually in the media, what people do with this billionaire ranking is just to say okay, there is more and more billionaire every year. And that's bad or that's good, depending on your opinion. But now it's not very surprising that you have more and more billionaires in a growing world economy. And you have a growing world population, you have a growing world economy. So there's nothing bad or surprising about the fact that there is more and more billionaires. So what I do is a bit more sophisticated, which is to take a fixed fraction of the world population, to look at the average wealth of this group and to see at what speed this has been growing year after year. So yes, between 1987 and 2013, so this is the longest period we have, after deduction of inflation. Now what you can see is that the top groups have been rising at 6 to 7% per year at the world level, so this include developed countries, developing countries, which is 3 times or 4 times faster than average wealth or average income in the world. So world GDP growth has been 3.3% per year over this period. In 2016, it's going to be like 3% or maybe a bit less than 3%. But over this period, it's been 3.3. Now, it's important to realize that more than half of world GDP growth has gone to a rising world adult population over this period. So that the per capita income has increased at only 1.4% per year. So, population growth is supposed to go to zero in the future, but it's not at zero yet, okay? Because of aging, because you still have so over this period, more than half of total world growth has gone to population growth. Average wealth has increased a bit faster than average income, but quite a bit faster, 2.1% instead of 1.4. This is because of the increase in the wealth to income ratio that I have shown you before. So wealth is rising a bit faster than income, which cannot continue forever, because wealth to income ratio is not going to go to infinity. So at some point, wealth and income will have to rise at the same speed. Now the top groups, in terms of wealth, have been rising 3-4 times faster than average, and actually 3-4 times faster than the size of the world economy, which of course cannot continue forever either, because if this was to continue forever, the share of world wealth going to billionaire would go toward 100%, which everybody would agree is excessive. And I'm not saying this will happen. I'm sure this will stop much before 100%. But where exactly will it stop? Nobody knows. Okay. So sometimes people say, well, it's okay because you have lots of entrepreneurs at the top and they are doing very useful things. I certainly believe that we need entrepreneurs, we need people with a lot of wealth. But I think we should be very clear. In principle, so you have a lot of mobility at the top. So indeed, the people at the top in 2013 are not the same than in 1987. According to Forbes, people at the top in 1987 were Japanese billionaires, which everybody has forgotten their name. And in 2013, you have Bill Gates, you have Carlos Slim, you have billionaires from India, from all over the place. So there is a lot of mobility in this ranking. But now the fact that there is mobility and there is new wealth, in itself, this should not imply that average wealth at the top is rising 3-4 times faster than the average wealth for the entire population. Because mobility should imply that some people move up, some people move down from the top, but on average, these two effects more or less compensate each other. So that average wealth at the top rises more or less at the same speed as aggregate average wealth. If we were in an equilibrium in the distribution of wealth with upward mobility, downward mobility, this is what you would see. So here, this is what's happening here cannot be explained just by having a successful entrepreneur, because successful entrepreneur means you also have less successful entrepreneurs who go down, and they should compensate each other. So here, you need more than that. So I think part of the explanation is that a lot of people at the top, at the world level, they are not necessarily entrepreneurs, but they benefited from a lot of privatization that happened over this decade. So if you take all the Russian billionaires, they did not invent oil fields or gas fields. Carlos Slim in Mexico, he did not invent the cell phone. He became owner of a large part of the telephone system in Mexico. Many people believe at very cheap prices as compared to the market valuation a couple of years down the road. So, we should not be too naive about this. It's always a complicated combination of evolution. There is another factor which probably explains an important part, which is that with financial deregulation, probably the inequality in access to very high financial returns has increased over time. So in order to illustrate this, let me just show you this data. This comes from US universities' capital endowments. So I'm showing this to you. This is not to depress you about the capital endowments of Harvard or Princeton, etc. This is just because at least these people publish data. So we know about their endowment. We know what they do with their endowment, how they invest it. Whereas for the Forbes people, we don't really know. So this is just conjecture. At least here we have reasonably good data. What you see is that they do very well. So you have 850 US universities with capital endowments. Between 1980 and 2010, they have an average return of 8.2. This is after deduction of inflation, of course, and after deduction of all administrative costs and financial fees. Okay, so this is a pure return to capital. Okay, net return, net of everything. Okay, so this is quite good. So 8.2%. You can see, the US universities are not putting their money in US Treasury bonds. I don't know why some people in the world do that, but clearly. What you see in these endowments is you see a lot of equity, you see a lot of private equity, you see a lot of commodity derivatives, you see a lot of sophisticated financial instruments. You don't see public bonds, and certainly not US public bonds. Now you see also that the higher the initial endowment, the higher the return, which is quite spectacular. You go from 6 to 10. So if you take Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they have a 10% return on average over this period. It's interesting to see. So if you take Harvard, right now their endowment is $40 billion. Now, their administrative fees are only 0.3% per year for the management of the wealth. But 0.3% of 40 billion is already more than 100 million per year. So if you have 100 million per year to pay for financial advice, even if these people are very costly, you can get a lot of financial advice. And if this allows you to get a return of 10% rather than 8 or 6, it's worth paying 0.3. Now, if you have an endowment of 100 million, you're not going to spend 100 million each year in financial advice, because you would have no capital left at the end of the year. And if you have 100,000 rupees, you can ask to your brother-in-law about financial advice, but maybe this is not going to work too well. So clearly, the textbook model of financial market is not supposed to be like that. According to the textbook model, if you have a perfectly efficient financial intermediation, everybody should have access to the same high return. You should go to your bank with 10,000 rupees, and the next morning the money will be invested in China or wherever the highest return to capital is in India, and everybody should get the highest return. Now the real world doesn't seem to work like this, and you have some people who manage to get very high return, some people who have zero or negative return because of inflation, and this has been a concern in this country for a long time, but this is an issue in pretty much everywhere. Now, if this was happening only to universities, you could say, well, after all, they are doing useful things with the money, why not? Except that, this creates a lot of inequality between universities, and also, if this is happening also to private individuals, then, in the long run, this can create a serious issue. So, one way to regulate this, of course, will be progressive taxation of wealth. So progressive taxation of wealth, first, is a way to produce information about how the different wealth groups are doing. And if in fact, when we have better information about wealth, we find that the top groups are not doing so well and are only rising at 1 or 2% per year, like the average, I would be very happy to say that we don't need very progressive wealth taxation. But if they are rising at 6-7% per year or 8% per year, it's difficult to say that 1 or 2 or 3% wealth tax is going to keep them. So at some point, looking at the numbers is important, and more transparency is important so that we can adapt our policy to whatever is happening. Now, is this going to happen in the future? So let me conclude by saying that the history of taxation is complicated and sometimes unpredictable. So this is a brief history of top income tax rate in US, UK, Germany, France. There was no income tax a century ago, or very low tax rate, and many people thought the income tax would never happen. until 1913 in the US, it was unconstitutional to have a federal income tax, and then, the constitution was changed, and then it happened. And sometimes things happen even when we don't expect them to happen. So, in effect, you can see, particularly in the US, the UK, top income tax rate of 80 to 90%, and then after Reagan and Thatcher, this has declined a lot. You see the same evolution for the taxation of wealth, or at least through the taxation of inherited wealth. Okay, so this is the same graph for top inheritance tax rate. So you can see that US, UK have gone very far in terms of top inheritance tax rate. So very large wealth transmission was taxed at top rates of 70-80% for many decades. In France and Germany, this was less extreme, partly because the redistribution of wealth in France and Germany had been done through other means, which is wealth destruction, a lot of inflation, partly nationalization after 1945. So, the Anglo-Saxon country used more progressive taxation than direct destruction of appropriation, which, I think in some ways is preferable. So you have different national trajectories. At the end of the period, all of these countries are between 40-50%. Japan recently increased from 45 to 55% their top inheritance tax rate. So India, I understand, it's 0% right now, which is really quite small by international standards. And I think it's important to realize that there are different ways to organize capitalism, to regulate inequality, and many. In Germany or Britain, I don't hear Merkel or Cameron, although they are not very left-wing, but I don't hear them saying that the inheritance tax rate should go to 0%. So I think it's, these debates about progressive taxation change over time, of course, but it's difficult to predict what will happen in the future. Let me just show, it's interesting to see that Germany, the only time when Germany has a 90% top tax rate is between 1946 and 1948. And this is when the tax policy of Germany is set by the Americans, by the Allied Control Council in Germany. And you have the same in Japan. And then in 1950, when Germany takes its sovereignty back, they go back to a top tax rate of 50%, and they want to go away from this crazy American level of 90%. Now, what's interesting is that, the US, they were not doing this in order to punish the Germans or the Japanese, because they were doing the same at home. So this was not a punishment, So in the US view of the time, this was part of the civilization package. You bring democratic institution, or you think you bring democratic institution, and you bring at the same time fiscal institution that prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy with extreme concentration of top income. So, I know this can seem very exotic to you today because this is far away, long ago, but this is not so long ago. And if you look at the evolution of tax rate in India, top tax rate in India, you have some similar evolution at the end of the period, although it's never been as extreme as in US or UK, the top tax rate. What's particular about India is that although the income tax has been there for a very long time, it is still limited to a very small group, a few percent of the population. This has no increase to 10 or 20 or 50% of the population, not to mention the entire population, but just going from 1-2% to 10 or 20 is a big difference, which has not happened yet in India. And also, as I said before, we actually know very little about how the income tax is being applied. We don't even know whether top income groups have increased at the same speed as GDP, less than GDP, more than GDP. And so, it's looking at the tax rate is nice, but looking at how the tax is actually working, I think, is even more important. So let me conclude, say that the history of income and wealth inequality is always is much more than a pure economic history. It is deeply social, cultural, political. It involves belief system about inequality, whether inequality is fair or not, national identities, sharp reversals. In a way, both Marx and Kuznets were wrong in the sense that there are powerful forces pushing either in the direction of rising or reducing inequality, and in the end, which one dominates really depends on the institution and policies that different societies choose to adopt. there's no magic bullet. There's a combination of institutions that are necessary, including progressive taxation of income, wealth, carbon is also another issue where I think progressive taxation rather than proportional taxation will be a huge improvement. Education, social labor laws play an important role. And finally, I think economic political democracy, including new forms of property, power structure, and participatory governance are in a way even more important. I mentioned the issue of worker co-determination, but there are many other issues about power structure and participatory governance that should be addressed. So my general belief is that there's a lot to learn from looking at this historical experience, and I very much hope that this lecture has convinced you that this is useful, looking at the history of inequality and comparing different historical experience with different countries. So thanks a lot for your attention. I prefer to treat separately the issue of wealth and return to wealth, like what I've done at the end, and look at this, scale effects, because the reason why higher wealth leads to higher return sometimes is not really related to any labor input. If you think of the university data, it's not that the professors at Harvard are working to have the high return as compared to the community college. It's they just pay outside financial advisor, and this is the net return. So this shows that pure return to capital does exist, and so. But I agree that in cases where it's a private individual rather than 1867, I guess this book was published in 2014. So there's been 150 years in between, so of course it's a completely different book, and it's a completely different record. In a way, this it's more than 150 years. It's also that in between you have the entire 20th century with this historical experience, first with reduction of inequality in capitalist countries, but after very large political shocks and rise of social and fiscal institutions that did not exist at the time of Marx, of course, that did not exist until World War I. And also, 20th century includes the experiment with Soviet-type communism, which not only was a disaster, but has generated a trauma in ex-communist countries like Russia and China, which now makes them behave in a way, in a much more extreme sort of capitalist manner than any capitalist country will do. In Russia, China, you have a very limited progressive taxation. In China, it's now it's the capitalist countries around China, like Japan or Korea or Taiwan, where there is, for instance, an inheritance tax of 30 or 40%. The billionaires, they want to go and die in communist China so that they have no inheritance tax at all. So this is a strange situation. And so that's part of the trauma also with the communist experiment, that people don't want to hear about any redistribution, and well, of course the elites are putting a very strong discourse in order to impose this view of the world, and probably this will not last forever. But anyway, that's part of what, the difference between the world Marx lives in and writes about, and what I write about. So this is a very different world. Now, to answer your question, is the natural evolution rising inequality? Again, there are very different forces going on. There are forces that push toward reduction of inequality, like convergence between countries, which has more to do with the diffusion of knowledge, the diffusion of education, than merely a market mechanism based on competition, I think. But this can be very powerful. At the same time, there are very powerful mechanisms pushing toward rising inequality. I think in the end, I guess the main difference with Marx is that at least in one version of the theory proposed by Marx, there's a pure, this cannot continue forever, in the sense that there's a pure sort of economic mechanism through which the system is going to come to a final crash somehow. Whereas what I try to stress in my book with this R bigger than G formula is that R bigger than G does not imply a final crash or exploding inequality.
you can have just a stabilization of inequality at an extreme level. So all what R bigger than G is saying is that if you have G equal 1% in the long run, R equal 5%, you can have extreme concentration of wealth, and all what this says is that this can perpetuate forever, and holders of very large wealth, they only need to reinvest 1/5 of their capital income, and they can consume the other 4/5 in order to have very high living standards, and still their wealth will rise as fast as the rest of the economy. So wealth-income ratio is not rising, it's stable. Inequality is not rising, it's stable. But it can be stable and perpetuate at an extreme level. So from a purely economic viewpoint, there's nothing that leads to a crash. It needs to be politics. It needs to be political mobilization, political institution. But economic forces themselves, there's no internal contradiction, in the sense that you can have very large inequality that continue forever. So I think that's a difference, a conceptual difference that's important.
What is your opinion about that?
Well, I think it's always difficult to have a quiet discussion about taxation because people get very excited very quickly, and so many people still, today are still not ready for a discussion about, this experience with very high top tax rate of 80-90% for very top income. So many people, in the West are not ready for this discussion. I think at some point we have to look at the evidence. And, the evidence is that if you look at a country like the US, productivity growth was much higher in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when the top tax rate were 80% than what they have been since the 1980s. So, in recent decades, top tax rates have gone down to, 28% under Reagan, and they stabilized between 30 and 40%. And you have rising inequality everywhere except in the productivity growth statistics. So in the sense that the growth performance of the US economy has been, as I said, 1.5% per year in per capita GDP growth, whereas in the 50s, 60s, 70s it was between 2 and 3% or more. And so it's, I think the evidence is that, of course you don't want to have 90% tax rate on anybody who's making more than 2 or 3 times average income. But above a certain level of income, paying top managers $10 million rather than $1 million, there's no evidence, there's no serious evidence that this brings any additional performance or growth. So, yeah, I think, it's possible to combine market forces and to have a lot of innovation with relatively low inequality and very inclusive tax policy and other policies. There are countries like Sweden and Denmark who are doing very well. In the European Union, if it was enough, you have 29 countries, so you can compare different level of taxation. If it was enough to have low tax to become rich, then Romania and Bulgaria will be richer than Sweden and Denmark, because they have 20% of GDP in tax revenue, whereas Sweden and Denmark have 50% of GDP in tax revenue. And so, if it was enough, it's okay to have high tax revenue if you use it for efficient public services and investment that is conducive to growth. So of course, it all depends what you do with the money. But if you build up more trust in government, more transparency in spending and taxation, the evidence is that you can have it both.
Okay, I have picked 2 questions which have not been asked earlier from the lot. There are too many of them. One is on technology, so I will read it for you. You may not be able to read it possibly. Would you say that technology has led to reduction or an increase in income inequality?
Well, technology has contributed to lead to a huge improvement in living standards in the long run. So in this sense, this is of course a very positive sum game from which everybody can benefit and from which everybody has benefited in the long run. Now, at the same time, I think it would be a mistake to believe that just natural forces are enough for everybody, or at least large groups of the population, to benefit from technological change. So it's really, it depends on the combination of technological change with other policies, so that people can benefit from technological change.
Well, this I believe is in the area of political economy, although it's not very specific. Economics like Piketty have explained it all and suggested ways. Then why are policymakers are staying away from taking the requisite steps or policies? I believe it is a political economy. So.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated question. I believe the power of ideology is very strong. I think people need narratives about their country, about inequality, about the growth trajectory of their countries, and these narratives take a long time to change. So right now we still live in a world where the dominant narrative, at least since the fall of the Soviet Union, but this has been reinforced through many other evolutions, is that we live in a world with a sort of sometimes unlimited faith in the ability of markets to regulate themselves, and the idea that market forces lead naturally to the right level of inequality. In a way, we live in a very extreme time where some people, you have all this discourse saying, we don't need really taxation anymore. We just need to wait for billionaires to give back some of their income and wealth, and this will be much more efficient than taxation and government. And I think this is very naive as a view of the world. And I think here again, it's important to look at the numbers, put these claims under public scrutiny. If you think, one example which I did not mention is if you look at, for instance, the example